Jin Hao, a prosecutor, a representative of justice, had just murdered his wife with his own hands in their home while their 3-year-old child's cries still echoed through the rooms. On the floor, his wife Liu Mingyao lay in a pool of blood, her final words still lingering. "Stop hitting me. I agree to the divorce." But it was too late. Why did a law enforcement official become a cold-blooded killer? And what turned a marriage into a 4-year nightmare? Let's explore this case with crime documentary files today. Jin Hao was born in Mengchun, Kangzhou, Hebei Province, into a family that appeared highly respectable on the surface. Both his parents were doctors at the local hospital and reportedly held shares in it, giving the family significant influence in this small town. Growing up in such an environment, Jin Hao developed an arrogant attitude from childhood, fearing no one. However, behind this glamorous facade lay a home filled with violence. His father regularly beat his wife and children, while his mother could only endure in silence. Jin Hao's childhood was marked not by encouragement or praise, but by his father's angry shouting, his mother's sobbing, and the sounds of household items being smashed. Living in such an environment, Jin Hao developed 3 survival rules early on. First, fists were the fastest way to solve problems. Second, women were merely possessions, to be pampered when pleased, to be beaten when angered. Third, no matter how much trouble he caused, his family's money and connections would always bail him out. Because of this, from middle school onward, Jin Hao became the school's nightmare. Students were bullied, teachers were defied, and during military training, he even dared to confront and fight the instructors. In everyone's eyes, Jin Hao was the epitome of a delinquent. The bitter truth was that he never felt ashamed of this behavior. Instead, he considered it a source of pride. Every time he caused trouble, his parents would step in to handle and smooth things over. This protection made Jin Hao increasingly believe that rules were only meant to constrain the weak, while he was born to trample on all regulations. He lived by another brutal principle. Whatever he wanted had to belong to him at any cost, and anyone who dared to displease him would inevitably pay the price. When college entrance exams came around, with academic results too poor to salvage, Jin Hao relied on his influential parents who used money and connections to get him into a law enforcement college. His parents thought that wearing that uniform would make him less arrogant, teach him discipline, and perhaps even reform him through exposure to the law. But reality proved the complete opposite. In Jin Hao's eyes, his civil service position wasn't a responsibility, but merely another layer of authority that allowed him to act with impunity. The victim in this case was Mingyao. She was born into an intellectual family where both parents were teachers. In her friends' eyes, she was beautiful, gentle-natured, academically excellent, and always among the top students in her class. Yet this gentle girl fell for Jin Hao during high school. Although everyone knew Jin Hao was a troublemaker, in the eyes of a young girl coming of age, his rebelliousness, his willingness to stand up and protect, and his readiness to fight for someone he liked became attractive qualities. Whenever any boy dared to look at Mingyao for too long, Jin Hao would immediately resort to violence. This twisted possessiveness, rather than frightening her, was interpreted by her as proof that he truly cared. Mingyao believed she was the princess who could tame this thorny person, using her gentleness to transform him into a good man. But this naive belief led her to make the worst decision of her life. During college entrance exams, with a score of 600, enough to guarantee admission to a top university, she threw away this precious opportunity. Just to follow Jin Hao, who had already been arranged by his parents for a spot in a prosecutor's college, Mingyao accepted a lower choice, abandoning her bright future to attend the same school as him. Mingyao's decision seemed insane to her parents, relatives, and friends. The whole family opposed it vehemently, everyone clearly seeing Jin Hao's true nature, a spoiled brat ruined by his parents, no different from a mud puddle. Meanwhile, their daughter was like a precious gem. A gem thrown into mud could only get dirty, never retain its original purity. Yet at that time, Mingyao remained immersed in fantasies of a great love. She refused to listen to any advice, clinging stubbornly to the belief that love could conquer all and would eventually change Jin Hao. Despite the confused looks and sighs of disapproval, she personally closed the door to a bright future and walked straight into the cramped cage that had been predetermined for her. The so-called perfect love and career was, from the beginning, nothing but a delusional dream. Another character in this case was Bai Liying. In public reports, information about Liying was scarce and her image rather vague, but in reality, she was the embodiment of evil. Previously, Liying had been Mingyao's close friend, the kind who could share secrets and exchange confidences. She had an attractive appearance and knew how to use her looks to manipulate men, but hidden beneath that pretty face was a twisted, pathologically narcissistic heart. Liying's greatest pleasure wasn't in loving or being loved, but in the sick thrill of controlling others. She particularly enjoyed watching men become jealous over her, chase after her, and even fight bloody battles for her. These scenes that might terrify others were a source of perverse satisfaction for her. She felt fulfilled as if she were directing a play, with those men as mere puppets. Not infrequently, Liying would boast to friends, "See? I'm amazing, aren't I? They're all going crazy over me." What Liying craved wasn't genuine love from one man, but the feeling that all men had to kneel before her. Therefore, when she witnessed Jin Hao's obsessive possessiveness toward Mingyao, she didn't perceive it as danger, but as a challenge. In Liying's eyes, this was an opportunity to prove that she was more alluring and powerful than Mingyao, that she could easily steal this untouchable man right from her best friend's hands. Driven by this sick desire for conquest and show-off mentality, Liying began secretly approaching Jin Hao. She personally buried the fuse that would turn the lives of 3 people into an unavoidable tragedy. A violence worshiper, a naive girl who believed in sacrifice, and a woman who took pleasure in playing with others' psychology. 3 people with completely opposite personalities and values, yet twisted together in a deformed bond. From the beginning, this was never a stable love triangle, but a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. After graduating from college, Mingyao and Jin Hao got married. Her parents remained deeply worried and opposed, but seeing their daughter absolutely determined that it had to be Jin Hao, they finally sighed and nodded in agreement. Mingyao's family prepared a dowry of 200,000 yuan, approximately $28,000, a substantial sum locally, hoping their daughter would have some foundation to live more comfortably and maintain some dignity in her husband's household. On their wedding day, Mingyao personally wrote a letter to Jin Hao. In it she wrote, "You can be my support. Loving you is my fortune. I pledge to live this life for you." Every word was filled with a young woman's naive faith and hope for a happy future. But she could never have imagined that the lifetime she anticipated would be tragically brief. Only 4 years, with almost every day soaked in blood and tears. Less than 10 days after the wedding, Jin Hao struck his wife for the first time. Over a trivial matter, he delivered a devastating slap. That slap not only stunned Mingyao, but also shattered the illusion she had long held that love could transform anyone. But immediately after that first slap, Jin Hao dropped to his knees, crying and apologizing, tears and snot streaming down his face. He swore it was just a momentary impulse and would absolutely never happen again. Faced with this scene, what could the soft-hearted Mingyao do but forgive? She also didn't dare tell her parents, fearing they would worry and that relatives would mock them. After all, this path was the choice she had desperately made, betting her entire future on it. But once the wound of domestic violence opens, it never heals. That first forgiveness was tantamount to giving Jin Hao a license to use violence at will. From then on, abuse became routine in their household. It started with verbal abuse, then pushing and shoving, then slapping, and finally punching and kicking. Jin Hao's temper became increasingly explosive, and his reasons for violence increasingly absurd. Sometimes it was just a wrongly spoken word, sometimes a meal that didn't suit his taste, and sometimes he would come home angry from work and need someone to vent his rage on. To fully focus on the family at Jin Hao's demand, Mingyao quit her job at the court and became a full-time housewife. From that moment, she completely lost her source of income and all connection to the outside world. Mingyao's world gradually shrank, revolving only around her husband, child, and those suffocating four walls. All the household money was controlled by Jin Hao. Every expense required begging for permission. But what she received in return was never understanding, but always interrogation accompanied by mockery and humiliation. Gradually, the once gentle and confident woman became small and submissive, living like a wounded bird trapped in a cage. Just the sight of Jin Hao raising his hand in the elevator would make her instinctively shrink back, then immediately force a placating smile to dispel the tense atmosphere. From then on, Mingyao wore long sleeves year-round, regardless of season. The purpose was nothing other than to hide the bruises and wounds, old injuries not yet healed before new ones appeared. When family members asked, she would just smile awkwardly and say she had fallen off her bike. Mingyao wasn't unaware of the pain. She was in agony to her very bones, but never dared to cry out. Everything she endured was just to preserve some dignity for her initial wrong choice, just to give her child what she called a complete family. While Mingyao was being abused beyond recognition, her former best friend Liying was secretly pushing her faster toward the abyss of this rotten marriage. Under the guise of concern, Liying appeared at Mingyao's house every few days. This gave her ample opportunity to interact with Jin Hao. Being naturally cunning, Liying understood very well the weakness of men like Jin Hao: arrogance, competitiveness, and the need to be worshipped. So she played her role perfectly, eyes always shining with admiration, mouth constantly full of sweet words. Just like that, it was enough to bring down Jin Hao, turning her best friend's husband into her own trophy. In front of Mingyao, Jin Hao was a cruel dictator who did whatever he pleased. But in the eyes of his mistress Liying, he became a hero to be celebrated. This contrast made Jin Hao fall rapidly, losing all self-control. Before long, the affair between Jin Hao and Liying became an open secret among their circle. Only Mingyao remained naive and blind to the truth. When malicious rumors gradually reached her ears, Mingyao initially refused to believe them. She confronted her husband, hoping for an explanation. But in response, she received only a more severe beating than usual, and the threat, "If you dare spread such nonsense again, I'll beat you to death." The conflict reached its peak when Liying became pregnant. With the child in her womb, she refused to remain a mistress in the shadows any longer. Liying began pressuring Jin Hao to divorce, demanding that he give her and the child proper recognition. Jin Hao also felt the time had come. He had long been disgusted by Mingyao's timidity and submission. Therefore, he officially spoke up, bluntly demanding a divorce. But what no one expected was that this time, the woman who had endured and suffered her entire life finally stood up to resist. Mingyao refused to agree to the divorce. Her reason was simple, but heartbreakingly heavy. The child was still young and couldn't be without a father. In Mingyao's heart at that time, she still held on to a last glimmer of hope. She believed that as long as she didn't let go, someday when Jin Hao grew tired of playing around outside, he would return home. But this very refusal drove Jin Hao and Liying, this blind pair of lovers, into a true frenzy. To force Mingyao to submit, Liying committed an act of ultimate evil. She edited footage of herself and Jin Hao being intimate into a 1-minute and 53-second video, then sent it directly to Mingyao. Those filthy images were like knives stabbing straight into the wife's heart. The moment she opened the video, Mingyao felt the entire sky collapse. This wasn't just a double betrayal from her husband and her closest friend, but also the ultimate humiliation of her dignity, both as a wife and as a woman. She was trampled, crushed, and then tortured further by the glee of the third party. Mingyao's spiritual world completely collapsed in that instant. But even after being betrayed to this extent, she still refused to let go. Notably, despite having studied law, she never thought to use legal means to protect herself. Mingyao chose the weakest, most desperate path. She went to Liying's house and knelt, begging her to spare her family. In response, her former best friend turned romantic rival only laughed contemptuously, flaunted more blatantly, while Jin Hao added more punches to his wife's suffering. The poverty, combined with divorce pressure, made Mingyao's life feel suffocated. Only then did she gradually realize this family might be beyond saving. She had to find another way of living for herself and her child. Her final wish was simply to buy an electric scooter for transportation and find a job to support herself. She had even spoken beforehand with the owner of a nearby steamed bun shop, agreeing that on September 1st, when her child started kindergarten, she would come to learn the work and earn some money to support her child. However, she never lived to see September 1st. On August 21st, 2025, throughout that entire day, no one knew how many times she had struggled internally. Finally, she made a decision: to call Liying. What exactly the two said in that call can no longer be verified. But based on what happened afterward, it's likely that Mingyao mentioned the pregnancy. That phone call was like a spark falling into a powder keg. Immediately, Liying ran crying to Jin Hao, both accusing and pretending to be vulnerable, saying that she and the baby in her womb were being threatened and harassed by Mingyao. In Liying's distorted account, Mingyao suddenly became the evil one threatening her and her unborn child. Jin Hao flew into a rage. For him, his wife's call had just crossed forbidden boundaries. First, it was a direct challenge to his absolute authority in the family. Second, the woman he had crushed under his heel dared to threaten his new lover, causing the woman he loved to suffer humiliation. This touched Jin Hao's pride. The decision was made immediately. Tonight, Mingyao would receive a bloody lesson, and the divorce matter would be resolved once and for all. That evening, Jin Hao began drinking, gradually pushing himself into a state of semi-consciousness. At 10 p.m., security cameras captured the final image of the family of three. In the elevator, the couple was still exchanging words, with Jin Hao even patting his wife's neck gently like a normal, affectionate gesture. Who could have suspected this was a sign foretelling the approaching tragedy? Perhaps at that moment, Mingyao had no sense that the man beside her had ignited murderous intent in his heart. The tragedy officially began the moment they entered their home. The home surveillance audio restored for us those hellish 10 minutes. At 10 p.m., when the family of three entered the hallway, Mingyao gently reminded her husband about his heavy drinking and not to frighten their child. Just 30 seconds later, violence erupted without warning. Jin Hao began savagely beating his wife. In the midst of panic, Mingyao still tried to remind her husband of their child's presence, hoping this might awaken whatever conscience remained in him. But Jin Hao had completely lost his mind. He dragged his wife from the living room to the hallway, ignoring her pleas not to hit her head and not to frighten the child. Despite her excruciating pain, her maternal instincts made Mingyao worry only about the child screaming in the room. By 10:02, Mingyao was completely exhausted and unable to stand. She begged for a sip of water as she felt dizzy and nauseous, but Jin Hao had become completely frenzied. He grabbed a chair and smashed it directly into his wife. In desperation, Mingyao cried for help, but no one could hear her. She struggled to crawl from the bedroom to the living room, moaning about unbearable pain. At 10:05, her consciousness began to fade, her final survival instincts causing her to whisper pleas for help. In the final minutes of her life, Mingyao chose the ultimate compromise, agreeing to divorce as Jin Hao wished. At 10:07, the surveillance captured only weak cries for help that could barely be heard. Then the entire room fell into silent stillness. Only the heart-wrenching cries of the child continued to echo through the empty room, like an indictment against the perpetrator. After committing the crime, Jin Hao never thought to call emergency services or perform any life-saving measures. He stood looking at his wife's motionless body on the floor, then calmly picked up his phone to contact his parents. His voice in that call was chillingly cold, announcing that he had just ended his wife's life as if discussing an ordinary matter. At midnight, Jin Hao's parents arrived at the scene. With their medical experience, they could tell with one glance that their daughter-in-law could not be saved. Yet the first reaction of this couple wasn't grief for a life that had just been taken, nor advice for their son to surrender and confess. Instead, they immediately began calculating how to help their son escape punishment. A plan to destroy evidence was immediately implemented with terrifying composure. Jinhao's mother took charge of directing everything like a professional director. She found clean clothes to replace the blood-soaked nightgown on her daughter-in-law, creating an appearance as if nothing unusual had happened. Next, she took cleaning supplies and meticulously wiped every trace of blood from the floors and walls, leaving no evidence that could reveal the crime that had just occurred. All evidence of the massacre was systematically erased. After completing the cleanup, they transported Mingyao's cold body to the hospital where their family held shares. There, they fabricated a story about death from sudden cardiac arrest. Even more outrageous was that the hospital colluded with them, providing falsified death certificates to cover up the truth. Hospital camera systems recorded an even more horrifying scene. Jinhao standing beside the gurney carrying his wife's corpse, his mouth continuously spewing venomous words, as if she were still alive to hear his final curses. Fortunately, Mingyao's father intervened in time. When he insisted on seeing the CT scan results, the horrific injuries to his daughter's head and throughout her body exposed the brutal truth. Without this intervention, the savage murder might have been covered up as a sudden death, and justice would never have been served. When the CT images appeared before his eyes, Mingyao's father needed only one look to understand the full horrific truth. The broken bones, brain trauma, and countless injuries throughout her daughter's body told the story of the 10 minutes of hell she had endured. Though his heart felt crushed, he controlled his emotions and immediately contacted the police. Faced with undeniable medical evidence, the entire charade by Jinhao's family completely collapsed. Police acted swiftly. Jinhao was arrested on charges of intentional homicide, while his mother was prosecuted for concealing crimes and destroying evidence. Recognizing the influence of local power networks, authorities transferred the case to another jurisdiction to ensure objectivity and fairness in the investigation process. When the case was made public, it caused shockwaves like a bomb in the small town and spread across social media. Public opinion couldn't believe that a civil servant representing justice could become such a vicious killer. The contrast between his duty to uphold the law and his act of savage murder left everyone stunned and utterly outraged. When the Jin family's cover-up actions were exposed online, public fury erupted even more. People couldn't believe that a family claiming to be intellectual, wealthy, and powerful could be so cold as to conspire in covering up a cold-blooded murderer. However, under increasing public pressure, the Jin family still didn't abandon their intention to use money for a settlement. Shortly after the case was exposed, before Jinhao and his mother were arrested, the mother and son still had the audacity to bring gifts to the Liu family home. Right in front of all of Mingyao's relatives, Jinhao's mother prostrated herself on the ground. But this wasn't genuine remorse. She couldn't shed a single tear. Instead, she could only repeat one phrase like a machine. Any condition can be met. Please write a letter of forgiveness. Forgive my son. Hearing this, Mingyao's mother stared directly at the person who had enabled and helped cover up the crime, shaking with rage. She declared firmly, "I don't want money, not a single penny. I only want your son to pay with his life for my daughter." The case of Liu Mingyao is not only a tragedy for a family, but also a warning for the whole society. An intelligent, gentle girl with a bright future buried her own life because of blind illusions about love, because of misplaced patience and sacrifice. A man given the opportunity to wear a public servant's coat turned into a devil, and his best friend became the most cruel traitor. All combined to turn this marriage into hell, leading to the painful death of a 25-year-old woman. And that is today's case. Thank you for watching and see you in the next videos.